Imagine the sound of human pride breaking. It is not a loud cry, not a scream of rage, and not even the clinking of shattered glass. It is a barely audible, dry, almost delicate crunch of mats under the weight of 5 heavy bodies that collapse to the floor simultaneously, as if at the command of an invisible conductor. April 1973, Hong Kong, Golden Harvest Studios. The clock on the pavilion wall is frozen at 2:15 p.m. Inside, the heat is so suffocating and sticky that it feels as if the air could be scooped up with a spoon, and the smell of cheap tobacco, makeup, and stale sweat has permeated even the brick walls. The filming of the legendary Enter the Dragon has been interrupted for a technical break, but it was in these minutes, in the ringing silence of the frozen sets, that the fate of not just a film, but the entire reputation of Hollywood was being decided. 5 stuntmen, hired from the very bottom of Kowloon, men whose bodies were covered in the scars of street triads and whose fists were calloused from real brawls, decided they had had enough. To them, Bruce Lee was not a legend, but an arrogant actor who demanded too much and waved his arms too beautifully in front of the lens. They were absolutely certain that all his skill was merely the magic of editing and thin wires hidden under his clothes. And they decided to tear off that mask right here, with no witnesses except for a terrified film crew. But before I tell you how this chaos began, I want you to pay attention to one detail that most present would have considered completely insignificant. An ordinary white terry cloth towel. Bruce draped it over his neck immediately after a take to wipe away the sweat. Remember this towel. In this story, it will play the role of an impartial judge, proving that on that day in the pavilion, there was not a man, but an element of nature. Do you think it all started with a fight? You're wrong. It all started with silence. The leader of this group, a massive man weighing nearly 100 kilograms, stepped forward. He didn't whisper. He wanted everyone to hear him. "Hey, little dragon," he shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "We've seen you dance for the cameras, but what about a real fight? Or can you only hit those who are paid for it?" Bruce Lee slowly set his water bottle on the floor. He didn't shout back. He didn't call for security. And this is where the first question arises. One that made director Robert Klaus turn cold. Why is Bruce smiling? That smile wasn't kind. It was like the grin of a predator that saw its prey jump right into its jaws. But the stuntmen, blinded by their own mass and rage, mistook this calmness for fear. They began to circle him, tightening the ring. 5 professional bouncers against one man weighing 60 kilograms. Any normal person in this situation would look for an escape route. But Bruce Lee was not normal. He wasn't looking for an exit. He was looking for a fulcrum. Ask yourself honestly, what would you have done in his place? Against you are 5 fighters armed with experience, and they have no script. You stand in the center, and the space around you is shrinking. Do you expect Bruce to take his famous crane stance or start kicking? But here occurs that very Santa Barbara effect that turns everything upside down. Bruce Lee continued to stand absolutely relaxed. His arms were down by his sides. He completely exposed his chest, his neck, his life. It was the most arrogant provocation in the history of martial arts. He was as if saying to them, "I am so much faster than you that I don't even need to defend myself." The thugs froze for a fraction of a second, baffled by this defenselessness. But the predator's instinct took over. The leader gave the signal, and in that second, 5 men lunged simultaneously, intending to crush Lee in an instant. They put all their hatred for the star into this rush, all their thirst to humiliate an idol. But they didn't know the main thing. Bruce Lee wasn't going to fight them. He was going to teach them a physics lesson they would remember for the rest of their lives. And at the moment when the first fist was supposed to touch his face, the pavilion plunged into that very visual silence, where time stops flowing linearly, turning into thick, viscous honey, in which the movements of the attackers seemed infinitely slow, while Bruce Lee, Bruce Lee simply vanished from the spot where he had stood a moment ago, leaving only a trail from that very white towel. At that moment, everyone present realized something unthinkable was about to happen, and what they would see in the next 18 seconds would forever erase the line between cinema and reality. But are you ready to learn the price Bruce paid for this demonstration of superiority and why the director screamed "Stop!" in horror before the fight had even reached its peak? The answer to this question is hidden not in the force of the blow, but in what happened to that very towel when the dust finally settled. To understand why those 5 men were so unshakably confident in their superiority, you must realize one frightening truth. They were not simple extras dreaming of Hollywood fame. They were soldiers of the Hong Kong street triads, people whose daily reality consisted of debt collection and brutal brawls in the dark alleys of Kowloon, where the only law was the knife and the heavy fist. They looked at Bruce Lee and saw not a master, but a paper tiger, a preening peacock who spent too much time in front of the mirror and too little in the real filth of the back streets. In their eyes, he was a traitor who had sold the sacred secrets of Kung Fu to Western barbarians for a 5-figure check, and they sincerely believed that one powerful blow to the jaw would forever wipe that arrogant smile off his face. But in the second the circle around Bruce closed, and the air in the pavilion literally trembled with the anticipation of blood, something happened that made everyone present doubt reality. Bruce Lee did not take a fighting stance. He did not defend himself. He made a move that contradicted every instinct of self-preservation. He slowly, almost lazily, adjusted that very white towel on his neck. This gesture was so mundane, so dismissive, that the gang leader froze for a second, not knowing if he was dealing with a madman or a being of a different order. Ask yourself, how can a 60-kilogram man stop the momentum of a 100-kilogram bouncer flying at him with intent to kill? Common sense says it's impossible. Physics says mass always beats speed. But Bruce Lee decided to cancel the laws of physics that day. When the first attacker, the largest of the 5, lunged, his fist should have shattered Bruce's cheekbone in a fraction of a second. But here the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, turning everything upside down. Bruce didn't block the blow. He simply shifted. It wasn't a jump or a dodge. It was as if a frame had been cut out of the film. One moment he was standing in front of the thug, and the next, he was already behind his back. And in that same second, the pavilion was filled with a sound that witnesses couldn't forget for years. A dry, sharp crack, like a shot from a small caliber rifle. It was the sound of a palm strike to the attacker's elbow joint. Bruce didn't hit the face, he hit the levers. He methodically and with surgical precision began to dismantle the bodies of his opponents. And here begins the strangest part, the thing that made director Robert Klaus grip his director's chair so hard that his knuckles turned white. He expected to see a beautiful fight, choreography that could be used in the film. But what he saw was too brutal for cinema. Bruce Lee moved 3 times faster than any professional fighter Klaus had ever seen. He didn't use long combinations or flashy spinning kicks. He struck short, economically, and terrifyingly. The second and third stuntmen tried to attack simultaneously, hoping to trap him in a pincer. Do you think Bruce started to retreat? You're wrong. He rushed toward them. He used the head of one as a shield while simultaneously delivering a ridge hand strike to the throat of the other. The air in the room seemed to thicken, turning into a vacuum where only gasps and impacts could be heard. But why doesn't Bruce stop? Why do his eyes, usually full of life, now resemble 2 pieces of cold anthracite? The answer lies in his philosophy. He wasn't just fighting, he was destroying the very idea that anyone could doubt his truth. Every 3 seconds, a new man hit the floor. It was the conveyor belt principle in action. Question, strike, answer, fall. The 4th thug, seeing his comrades writhing on the mats, hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that microscopic pause proved fatal. Bruce Lee closed the distance instantly. He didn't hit him with a fist. He simply touched his chest with 2 fingers and gave a sharp thrust, the famous 1-inch punch. The 100-kilogram man flew back 3 meters, knocking over a light stand, and collapsed into the darkness of the pavilion. At that moment, a silence fell over the hall, broken only by the sound of dripping sweat. But look at Bruce. He stands in the center of this carnage, and that very white towel is still lying on his neck in perfect order. It isn't even wet. How is that possible? Any sudden jerk should have thrown the fabric off, but Bruce moved with such extreme fluidity that centrifugal force simply didn't touch his shoulders. He defeated 4 men without even disturbing the folds of his clothes. Only one remained, the leader, the man who started this hell. He stood there, his whole body trembling, looking at his crippled friends, and in his eyes was a terror that cannot be acted. He realized that the letter he had sent Bruce with his challenge had reached its destination, but the reply was too heavy to survive. And in the second Bruce Lee slowly turned his head toward the last enemy, everyone in the studio realized something was about to happen that would forever change their understanding of what a human being is capable of on the brink of life and death. But was Bruce himself ready to pull the trigger of this human destruction machine, or would mercy wake up in him at the last moment to save the life of this wretched thug? The answer to that question hung in the air until Bruce Lee took his final, 11th step. In that very second, while the echo of the 4th stuntman's fall was still vibrating under the vaults of the Golden Harvest Pavilion, time in Hong Kong didn't just slow down, it turned into a stationary, frozen crystal of absolute horror. The gang leader, a massive man with a scar crossing his right eyebrow, was left one-on-one with a man he had considered a mere painted actor just a minute ago. Do you think he turned to run, or fell to his knees, begging for mercy? That would have been logical, but in the reality of 1973, poisoned by street pride, everything worked differently. The fear in his head transformed into the pure, distilled rage of a cornered beast. He understood that his reputation in Kowloon had just been torn to shreds, and the only way to get it back was to leave Bruce Lee lying in his own blood. With a dry, metallic click, he flicked open a butterfly knife he had hidden in his sleeve, and that sound, in the silence of the pavilion, rang out like the cocking of a hammer before an execution. The onlookers behind the scenes, the lighting techs, the makeup artists, and the director himself stopped breathing, realizing the rules of the game had changed. This was no longer a sparring match. It was an attempted murder in real time. But look at Bruce Lee, or rather, feel his state of being. He didn't flinch. He didn't change his posture. He continued to stand with his arms down, and his gaze was directed not at the knife, but somewhere through his opponent into infinity. Why is he so calm? Does he not see the steel in the hands of a professional killer? And here comes that moment of visual silence, when it feels as if someone turned off the sound for the entire planet, leaving only the low hum of the red-hot spotlights and the rhythmic beat of a heart. Drip, drop. That's the sweat from the leader's chin hitting the mats, and the sound seems deafening. The thug took a breath, his shoulders tensed, and he lunged forward, aiming straight for Bruce's throat, putting the entire mass of his 100-kilogram body into the thrust. Do you expect Bruce Lee to deliver his famous flying kick now, or perform a flashy backflip? But here, the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, making your brain stall from the surprise. Bruce didn't move until the very last millisecond. When the blade was already 10 centimeters from his neck, he made a move that is impossible to see at normal playback speed. He didn't block the arm with the knife. He simply shifted his center of gravity half an inch to the right. The blade sliced the air where his carotid artery had been a moment ago, and in that same second, Bruce delivered his counterstrike. It wasn't a fist. It was a short gunshot-like strike, with the base of his palm into the elbow crease of the attacking arm. The crunch of bone sounded simultaneously with a cry of pain, and the knife, flashing in the light, flew into the darkness of the pavilion. But Bruce Lee wasn't finished with his symphony of destruction. Using the momentum of the falling giant, he intercepted his other arm and made a sharp, surgically precise jerk. The gang leader, losing his orientation in space, felt the ground vanish from beneath his feet. At that moment, absolute silence fell over the hall. Have you ever heard what a vacuum sounds like? That is exactly what everyone present felt. Bruce Lee didn't finish him off. He simply froze an inch from the opponent's face, and his fist, clenched so hard the knuckles were white, stopped exactly in front of the thug's nose. The airwave from this non-delivered blow was so powerful that the leader squeezed his eyes shut, expecting death. But death did not follow. Bruce slowly unclenched his fingers, and here comes the intellectual orgasm for which we are deconstructing this story. Look at Bruce Lee's neck. Remember that white terry cloth towel, our dagger I mentioned at the very beginning? During all 18 seconds of the fight, while he was tossing 5 armed men, while he was lunging and shifting, while he was dodging a knife, that towel didn't even budge. It lay on his shoulders in perfect order, as if he had been sitting in a chair reading a newspaper the whole time. Do you understand what this means from the perspective of physics? It is proof of absolute non-human control over every muscle. Bruce moved so smoothly and economically that centrifugal force simply didn't have time to act on the fabric. He defeated 5 predators without even disturbing the nap of the towel. The gang leader opened his eyes and saw that white towel right in front of him. He looked at it, then at Bruce's calm face, and in that moment, his will was broken completely. He realized he had fought not a man, but a ghost, who allowed him to live only out of curiosity. The silence in the studio became unbearable, and in that silence, the voice of the director rang out, stammering just one word, "Bruce!" But what exactly did the director see on the monitor the second he pressed pause? The answer to this question will turn this street fight into the greatest mystery in cinema history, one you never even suspected. When the last glint of the butterfly knife's steel faded into the shadows of the set, and Bruce Lee's fist, frozen a millimeter from the leader's nose, slowly unclenched, a silence so deafening fell over the pavilion that you could hear the filaments cooling in the massive studio spotlights. This was that very visual silence, a moment of absolute vacuum where 80 people, from camera operators to makeup artists, simultaneously forgot how to breathe. The gang leader, this 100-kilogram beast, was still on one knee, and his eyes, wide with terror, were fixed not on Bruce's face, but on that very object we called our dagger. He was staring at the white terry cloth towel, lying motionless on Lee's shoulders. Do you understand the shock this man felt in that second? He had just been part of a hurricane. He had tried to kill. He had seen his comrades fly apart like dry leaves. But before him stood a man who had walked through the storm without even ruffling the nap of his clothing. This was not just a defeat. It was a collision with a force that did not obey the laws of inertia and chaos. And in the thug's head, that Santa Barbara effect occurred, where his worldview collapsed completely. Do you expect Bruce to spit on him now, or say something pompous about honor? You're wrong. Bruce Lee did something much more frightening in its simplicity. He reached out his hand, but it wasn't a gesture of threat. It was an open palm, inviting him to stand. Bruce looked at the leader, and in his gaze, there wasn't a drop of the rage that had turned him into a dragon a second ago. There was only the infinite, almost bored weariness of a master explaining to a child, for the 100th time, why you shouldn't touch a hot stove. "You think too much about how to strike," Bruce said, and his voice in the ringing emptiness of the pavilion sounded like the whisper of eternity itself. "You fight with space, but you must become part of it. You tried to catch water, but water has no shape that can be grasped." The leader, whose fingers were still trembling from the adrenaline crash, hesitantly placed his hand in Bruce's palm. And in the second, Bruce Lee, with one light, almost weightless movement, pulled this giant to his feet. A collective exhale swept through the pavilion. It was the sound of relief mixed with awe. The 5 stuntmen, who a minute ago dreamed of breaking Bruce's ribs, now stood around him, with their heads bowed, and in their silence there was more respect than in all the applause he had ever heard. But why was director Robert Klaus still sitting motionless, unable to utter the sacred cut. Why was he staring at the monitor with an expression as if he had seen his own death? Here, a new twist of intrigue enters, a loop that makes you listen to every word. Klaus slowly beckoned Bruce to the screen. "Look," he whispered, pointing to the footage the camera had just captured. "We can't use this." Bruce frowned. Was he not graceful enough? Or did the towel finally slip? No. The problem was something else, and it was so incredible that it made the entire crew crowd around the small black and white monitor. On the film that was supposed to capture 18 seconds of fighting, there was no fight. There were only blurred shadows, and stuntmen suddenly falling to the floor as if cut down by an invisible sniper. Bruce Lee's speed turned out to be higher than the frame rate of the movie cameras of that time. 24 frames per second simply couldn't record the movements of his hands and feet. To the technology, he was a ghost existing in the gaps between the image captures. Do you understand what this led to? The greatest fight in history, a real no-holds-barred brawl, turned out to be useless for the film because the audience in the cinema simply wouldn't believe their eyes. It would look like cheap editing, like a camera operator's error. Bruce Lee stood before the monitor, watching himself switch off 5 men without even appearing to wind up, and a strange, bitter smile flickered in his eyes. He realized that his reality was too big for the frame of the screen. That dagger, the white towel, looked like a frozen statue on the monitor, while annihilation was happening to his opponents all around it. The director looked at Bruce and said a phrase that forever changed the approach to filming action movies. "Bruce, you have to play slower. You have to give them a chance to see how you kill them. Otherwise, they'll think we're cheating them. Ask yourself honestly, what is it like to be so perfect that you have to pretend to be weak and slow just so people will recognize your strength?" In that second, Bruce Lee realized that his true mastery would always remain off-camera, hidden from the crowd, just like the place where he actually drew his energy. But what exactly happened in those 2 seconds when the camera lost sight of him entirely? What detail, hidden in the shadows of the set, made one of the stuntmen leave the profession forever and become a monk immediately after this fight? The answer to this mystery will overturn everything you knew about the dragon's philosophy. But before we open that door, you must hear what Bruce whispered to the leader as he was leaving the set. When the noise of the cooling spotlights became the only sound in that cursed pavilion, and the 5 men who until recently considered themselves masters of the streets began to slowly and painfully rise from the mats, the world of martial arts split forever into before and after, though no one present then realized they had just witnessed not a fight, but an act of divine revelation. You probably think that these stuntmen, humiliated in front of the entire film crew, harbored a grudge, ran to complain to producers, or started planning revenge in a dark alley as the laws of the Triads dictate. That would be logical. That would be expected. But here the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, making your heart beat faster. Not one of them uttered a word of protest. Moreover, in their eyes, as they watched the departing Bruce, there was not anger, but a primal sacred terror mixed with absolute adoration. But why? What did they feel during those 18 seconds that the camera, working at 24 frames per second, couldn't capture? The answer is hidden in that short whisper Bruce Lee left in the leader's ear before finally letting go of his hand. Witnesses say Bruce didn't threaten, he didn't promise retribution. He simply uttered a phrase that forever changed the trajectory of this man's life. "Your body is a temple, but you have let in the merchants of fear. Cleanse it, or you will never be free." You might think this is just a beautiful quote from a philosophical treatise, but for a hardened street fighter, these words became a detonator that blew up his habitual reality. The viewer expects the banquet to continue, expects more fights, but here we encounter an intellectual catharsis that flips everything. 3 days after this incident, the most aggressive of the attackers, the very giant who first lunged at Bruce, simply didn't show up for filming. He didn't just skip work. He vanished, left the city, abandoning everything: money, gang connections, and a film career. And only years later did it become known that this man had gone to a Buddhist monastery in the mountains, dedicating the rest of his days to prayer and repentance, because, in his own words, Bruce Lee's strike touched not his flesh, but his soul, exposing the utter insignificance of his malice. Do you understand the scale of this influence? Bruce Lee didn't just defeat them physically. He performed an exorcism, striking out of them the very need for violence. And here we return to our dagger, to that very white terry cloth towel that had remained on the master's neck the entire time. It became a silent witness to the fact that true greatness needs no effort. It simply exists. This towel, which didn't move a millimeter during the chaos, became a symbol of Bruce Lee being in a state of mushin, emptiness of mind, where there is no room for fuss, fear, or anger. It was a moment of truth that proved Bruce Lee was not an actor playing a master, but a master who sometimes agreed to play in movies. Director Robert Klaus later admitted that he couldn't sleep that night, replaying those 18 seconds in his head and looking at the empty pavilion where the smell of sandalwood and sweat still lingered. He realized that his film Enter the Dragon could never convey even a tenth of what this man actually was. But why then does the world continue to argue about his strength? Why are there still those who call him a fake? Here lies the final, bitterest loop of tension. Bruce Lee died just 3 months after this fight, never living to see the premiere of his greatest masterpiece. His death spawned thousands of conspiracy theories, from Triad revenge to an ancestral curse. But those who were in the pavilion on April 14, 1973, knew the truth. They knew he had simply fulfilled his mission on this planet. He showed us that a person can be like water, soft, yet able to crush stone, fluid, yet remaining oneself even in the epicenter of a storm. And now, as the curtain of our story falls and you hear only the echo of that whistle, I want to hand this white towel to you and ask a question that will define your understanding of strength. We live in an era of loud words, bright filters, and performative aggression, where everyone tries to seem stronger than they actually are. But look at Bruce Lee in that dressing room. He didn't prove his power with shouts or a mountain of muscle. He proved it with silence and the stillness of the fabric on his shoulders. Who was he to you that evening? Was he the true hero who sacrificed his peace to teach a lesson to lost souls and save them from themselves? Or was he a non-human demon whose perfection was so terrifying that it broke people's psyches, stripping them of their will and forcing them to flee to monasteries? Whose side are you on in this debate? The side of those who see cruelty in this act, or the side of those who see supreme mercy? And did you notice that detail at the beginning of my story? That very poster in Ealing? Write in the comments at what minute you realize that these 5 stuntmen had already lost before they even started their attack. I will read every one of your answers, because it is in your reaction that the true legend of the dragon lives, the one who knew how to win without ever leaving a state of peace.